Okay, so this is chapter 13. This is the introductory chapter to our unit on the Civil War. This would be a good time to open up your textbook. And this chapter begins on page 258. Go ahead and take a look at the headings and subheadings. Flip through, create a prediction statement, look at the maps, the pictures, the captions, your sidebars. There's some political cartoons in this chapter. So go ahead, pause the video for a couple minutes and skim through there. Don't skip this step. It's actually really important. It's going to help you to retain more information if you kind of preload and know what to expect. Okay, ignore this. Vocabulary, we already did some of this. Okay, here are your major headings and subheadings for the entire chapter. There's 3 sections, and we're going to try to just get through these as quickly as possible. I'm hoping that the whole entire chapter will take us less than 30 minutes. Okay, so section 1, controversy. Your objective for this chapter is that you should be able to explain, or for this section, you should be able to explain the sectional differences within the United States, both then and now, and weigh the advantages and disadvantages of sectionalism. And this is something we'll discuss in class, and maybe we might actually have a discussion post on course sites. Okay, so we know that over the last few chapters, we've seen the United States expand through the Louisiana Purchase, through the Mexican-American War, and through just pretty much good old-fashioned bargaining and compromise. So we almost pretty much have the United States as we know it today. Okay, and what's going to cause some conflict between the two sections is the spread of slavery. Remember that the balance of slave states and free states in the legislature is guarded very, very closely at this point in time. And so allowing slavery in new territories that we would gain from Mexico is not going to be something that is desirable for the free states, because that would throw off the balance, and also because a lot of people are against slavery. It's not just about the balance. Okay, so at the very beginning of this chapter, we see the Wilmot Proviso, which was a bill that was, it was an amendment attached to a bill that pretty much said we will not allow slavery in the territory gained from Mexico. So we won't extend slavery further. So this act, the Wilmot Proviso, would be passed through the House of Representatives several times, but it was rejected in the Senate because the Senate was controlled by the slave states. So it actually never comes to be. Okay, secondly, we have the Calhoun Resolutions. Very famous Southerner, John C. Calhoun. And he proposes that we view the territories as common possessions of the states, that the territories don't actually belong to the federal government, that all of the states together have ownership of the territories. It's kind of weird, right, to think of the federal government as something and then all of the states as something else. So he suggested that slave owners, their property, which would be their slaves, should be protected in these territories as such, because it's not, that the territories shouldn't necessarily be under the jurisdiction of the federal government when it comes to issues like slavery. So the only time that these territories could prohibit slavery is once they had become a state, and if they put that in their state constitution. And he claimed that past instances, such as the Missouri Compromise, where it had said that slavery would be prohibited, that was only agreed to in order to preserve the Union, kind of as a last ditch effort at doing that. Okay, so there's a compromise position between the Wilmot Proviso and the Calhoun Resolutions. And this goes back to popular sovereignty, which we've talked about before when we talked about the drafting of the Constitution. This is just a little different. Pretty much this says that each territory should decide on its own whether or not to allow slavery. So the people that live in the territory could vote on the issue of slavery. They wouldn't have to wait to become a state to make that decision. This idea is strongest amongst the Democrats, who for the most part are going to be pro-slavery, especially in the South. Southern Democrats are all pro-slavery. Stephen Douglas, who Lincoln will have the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates with, he's actually not from the South, but he's a Democrat, and this is kind of his baby, this idea that the states or the territory should decide using the concept of popular sovereignty. Okay, let's look at the election of 1848. Okay, the Democrats are going to nominate Lewis Cass. The Whigs will nominate Zachary Taylor, remember the war hero of the Mexican-American War. And the Free Soil Party, which is a party that is going to want to forbid or prohibit the extension of slavery into the territories, but was okay with allowing slavery to exist where it already was. The Free Soil Party is going to nominate Martin Van Buren. Okay, so this is one of those times in history where we see a third party form. Okay, and their motto or their slogan is free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. But in the end, Zachary Taylor will win this election. And you can go ahead and look at the votes. You can see the popular vote and the electoral votes. On page 260, you have a map there. Okay, California. So, California is also going to add to this sectional tensions between the North and the South. It's a territory that we've acquired from Mexico, and while we wanted it mostly for the access to the Pacific Ocean, something's going to happen that changes all of that. So Swiss immigrant John Sutter is going to find gold. Actually, it's someone that works for him is going to find gold at this construction mill, or this at his lumber mill in 1848. And they kind of try to keep this hush-hush, and this is in Northern California, near Sacramento. But it finally gets out, and this causes the California Gold Rush. This is where you get the term 49ers from, because the first wave of miners are going to come in 1849, and you have hundreds of people from all over the world, even the Chinese, coming to Northern California initially to mine gold. And the sad fact is that most of these people did not become wealthy off of mining gold. It's really the guys that were selling the supplies to all of these people. This is where you get these boom towns. And we'll see that here in the state of Nevada too with silver. These boom towns that grow up overnight, and people need, food, and they need a place to stay, and they need supplies, and the people that are offering those things, they're going to be the ones that make the money. Okay. So now we have the question of statehood for California. California is not really prepared to handle all of this increased population because of the gold rush. So the government pretty much encourages them to apply directly for statehood, to kind of skip the whole territory process. And the southern states don't really like that because they're worried about the balance of free and slave states again, because they're pretty sure California is not going to come in as a slave state. It's going to probably come in as a free state and throw off the balance. So we have one of the greatest debates in congressional history take place over the issue of California statehood. And we're going to hear from Henry Clay, from Calhoun, and from Daniel Webster. And altogether, this will get us to the Compromise of 1850. Calhoun suggests, and you can see here my picture there on the right is the actual picture of John C. Calhoun and how he kind of looks like Doc Brown from Back to the Future. If you've ever seen that movie, they look strikingly similar. Anyway, Calhoun suggests that California be admitted as a free state, and that the slave trade be abolished in the District of Columbia, which, okay, that's like Washington, D.C., that area there is the District of Columbia. And the slave trade means that you couldn't buy or sell slaves anymore, but you could still own slaves in the District of Columbia. That a federally enforced fugitive slave law be put into effect, meaning if a slave runs away, that the federal government would support that slave being returned to its owner. Again, protection of slavery in the District of Columbia. And the fifth item there is that new territories of Utah and New Mexico but would be organized without reference or restriction to slavery. So we could organize a territory, and then later, like, kind of, we're pushing off the issues, really. But later on, they could decide for themselves whether or not, or the government could decide later whether or not they would be slave or free states. And for the most part, people already know that places like Utah and New Mexico are not going to support a slave-driven economy. They're not going to support that type of agriculture. Okay. So anyway, Zachary Taylor is going to oppose the whole compromise. Hold on 1 second. I feel like we're missing something. All right, maybe not. Okay. So Daniel Webster is going to go ahead and also speak. He is from the North, but he's really speaking because he wants to keep the Union together. That's his primary concern. And this is known as the 7th of March speech. It's probably one of his best speeches that he ever gives. He says that the bounds of slavery were already set by the Northwest Ordinance, says, and the Missouri Compromise, that slavery is allowed here and there, and we've already decided this. We shouldn't be arguing over it again. He recognizes that the geography of the new territories, like I said, Utah, New Mexico, that's not going to support a slave economy. So he will support the Compromise of 1850, which is pretty much Calhoun's, Clay's proposal. Okay, so we have some typos here, or I don't know what happened here. This is old, so forgive me. That should say Clay, not Calhoun. That is a picture of Calhoun, and that might be a part of what happened there. Okay. Anyway, Zachary Taylor, remember, he doesn't support this compromise, even all of these men are in favor of it. He ends up dying of food poisoning from eating cherries and milk and cucumbers. And he's replaced by Millard Fillmore. Okay. Pretty much here, what I want you guys to focus on is the Fugitive Slave Law, which was a part of this compromise of 1850. It was supposed to guarantee the return of runaway slaves if they ran north. They were supposed to be returned to their owners. Just like any other property would have been. But many people in the North who are abolitionists, who don't believe in slavery, are going to purposefully break this law. And even some states of the North are going to pass personal liberty laws, which pretty much say you can choose whether or not you want to follow the fugitive slave law. So it's not really a law then. And the South is going to look at that and feel like the federal government isn't really supporting them and isn't really looking out for them. Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's going to become one of the most popular pieces of propaganda in American history, along with Common Sense by Thomas Paine during the American Revolution. It's going to be, for many people, the first thing that they know or read about slavery, and so it's going to inspire a lot of people to kind of speak out against slavery. So abolitionists, and that, remember, abolitionists don't want slavery, they want to get rid of it. They begin to attack the South as a whole. The South is really interesting because if you know anything about kind of the demographics of that time, only 5% of the South actually owned slaves. So you have this very rich planter class of people who own many slaves, and then you have all of these other white citizens who live under that, who don't own slaves but are going to fight for this cause, and that's kind of interesting. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of those reasons would be that they've been pretty much convinced that if we free the slaves, they're going to be fighting with the slaves for jobs. It's just going to kind of throw the whole social order out of whack. So they're not fans of that. We have a group known as the Fire Eaters. That was the vocab term. These are radical extremists who would like to see the South leave the Union. So after 1850, we see the U.S. pretty much just falling apart along this sectional divide between North and South, enslaved and free state. Here's your paragraph shrink: compromise, debate, tension. What view of the slavery in the territories was expressed in the Wilmot Proviso, the Calhoun Resolutions, and popular sovereignty? For the Wilmot Proviso, you saw that it wanted to prohibit slavery in the territories acquired from Mexico. The Calhoun Resolutions wanted to protect slavery in the territories, and popular sovereignty wanted to allow settlers in the territories to decide the issue for themselves. Number 2, what 2 sea routes did the 49ers take to California? This isn't really going to be on the test, but just so that you know, they went by sea to Central America, across the Pacific, or just around the tip of South America. What were the 5 provisions of the Compromise of 1850? California be admitted as a free state, slave trade to be prohibited in D.C., Fugitive Slave Act, that slavery in the District of Columbia be protected, new territories should not be organized with regard to slavery. Why did some Northerners who were not abolitionists oppose the fugitive slave law? Feared the lack of safeguards in the law could result in free blacks being kidnapped and sent into slavery. What was the single most important piece of abolitionist propaganda? Who was the author? Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Okay, so if you are caught up with your homework, you should stop the lecture here, and this is where you would pick up again. So note the time in your notes. Okay, Section 2, Conflict, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We've already introduced Senator Stephen Douglas. He's a Democrat. He is from Illinois. He wants to see the Transcontinental Railroad go through his state, because if it goes through his state, that's going to be money for his state. It's going to be trade, building. It's just going to be a real boost to their economy. But this would require organization of the territories to kind of benefit the state of Illinois. So we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and pretty much this repeals the Missouri Compromise line in order to organize these 2 territories. And he, again, remember, he really thought that the concept of popular sovereignty would allow for compromise over the issue of slavery, allowing the people to decide whether or not they wanted slavery in their own territory. And you can kind of see a picture here. The Kansas and Nebraska territories are not just what we know today of the state of Kansas and the state of Nebraska. They're much larger. Okay, during this time, we are going to see the rise of the Republican Party, which hadn't really existed before then. And there's going to be pretty much a civil war in Kansas, and that's why we're going to get that term Bloody Kansas from. It's going to be a mini pre-Civil War there. Okay, so the Whig Party didn't really ever have strong ideas. It doesn't have a good showing in the election of 1852, and arguing over the Kansas-Nebraska Act pretty much destroys the party, and it leaves a gap in our 2-party system. Okay, we have the Know Nothing Party. They're also known as the American Party. They pretty much rise up in reaction to increased immigration from Catholic countries. They don't like Catholics. They don't like immigrants. They're called the Know-Nothings because they kind of, it has to do with kind of secret societies and whatnot, so it's kind of like a little joke on their name that they would say that they didn't know anything about the secret order if they were asked. Okay, so you have most Northerners joining this party, the Republican Party. And so Abraham Lincoln, who had been a Whig, is now going to become a Republican. So really the birthplace of the Republican Party is in Ripon, Wisconsin. It's an anti-slavery party. It's pro-business. It's nationalistic, meaning it wants to, keep the Union together, and it's almost virtually non-existent in the South. Okay, for the election of 1856, the Republicans are going to nominate John C. Fremont. Remember, he's one of the great explorers of the West. He was involved with the Bear Flag Republic in California. And so they kind of take the Free Soilers little campaign slogan and modify it a little bit. Free speech, free press, free soil, free men, Fremont, and victory. The Know-Nothings will nominate Millard Fillmore. The Democrats will nominate James Buchanan, who is actually from Pennsylvania, but he sympathizes with the South. And he'll actually be able to win a plurality, not the majority, but this is because he's the only candidate that has support across the nation. He's not just restricted to one area. Okay, so this issue, or the concept of popular sovereignty, is going to cause Kansas to be flooded with pro and anti-slavery forces, because each of them is going to try to vote their way in. We have the sack of Lawrence take place. You have pro-slavery people known as border ruffians, and the anti-slavery forces known as free staters, getting into a conflict here in May of 1856. The border ruffians are going to go in and kill quite a few people, burn the town of Lawrence. So we see this increased occurrence of violence. Then we have the Brooks Sumner episode, which is one of just kind of, I don't know, I find it to be one of the more interesting episodes in history. We have a senator from Massachusetts, Sumner, and a representative, Brooks, from South Carolina. There are some comments that are made between Sumner and somebody else, not even Brooks. Brooks feels that he has to defend this person, and ends up beating Sumner with a cane, and so badly that Sumner kind of suffers nerve damage, goes to Europe to try to recuperate, and Brooks is reelected. People congratulate him. They send him new canes with notes of congratulations for beating this guy, and it's just kind of insane. If you can imagine us having two members of Congress getting into a fight of this severity. Okay, this is John Brown. He's pretty radical abolitionist, and this is one of the first times we will see him at the Potawatomi Massacre. He'll end up killing 5 pro-slavery settlers, and John Brown has some interesting ideas about sin and how sin, there can be no forgiveness of sin without pretty much the shedding of blood, and he's kind of misinterpreting that to mean that pretty much that the slave South needs to bleed so that it can be forgiven of the sin of slavery. Okay, this is something I want you guys to think about. So look up this verse, Hebrews 9:22, and kind of decide what that really means, and then kind of think about how it's dangerous if we misapply scripture, something like this. And you might want to think about other examples of misused scripture. And I would write this down in your notes so you can come to class and we can talk about this. Okay, the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave of an army surgeon. The army surgeon takes Dred Scott with him to a free state, into some territories. They travel around. He is returned to Missouri, and once his master dies, he argues that since he had been in a free state, he could not be re-enslaved. So he pretty much argued that by crossing over that line, he was now free, and he couldn't be brought back to a slave state and be made a slave. The Supreme Court, which at the time is pro-Southern, with Chief Justice Roger Taney, ruled that Scott was not a citizen, that he was property, and so he had no right to sue. His case shouldn't even be in the Supreme Court, or be brought before the Supreme Court. So free blacks were also not citizens. So even if he was free, free blacks aren't citizens, so they also have no right to sue within this court. They ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional on the grounds that it deprived slaveholders of their property. So if you were a slaveholder and you traveled across that compromise line, the Missouri Compromise deprived you of what was yours, and that was unconstitutional. And so the decision was made that slavery was legal in all territories until the territory could vote it out as a state. So this is kind of a landmark decision going into the Civil War. Okay, here's Stephen Douglas. Remember, we've talked about him before. He does not support slavery, but remember, he's a Democrat. But so he does support the theory of popular sovereignty, that the people should decide for themselves the issue. He's going to have a famous debate with Abraham Lincoln over the issue of slavery. We will perhaps watch a reenactment of this. Stephen Douglas kind of takes up the banner of this Freeport Doctrine, which says that territories could still prohibit slavery by refusing to adopt laws that established slavery and protected slavery, and so they're still exercising popular sovereignty. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln, probably one of our most famous presidents. He was born in Kentucky, moved to Indiana. His mother died when he was very young. He served 4 terms in the legislature, one in the House of, or in the state legislature, and one in the House of Representatives. He's against slavery, but he's leaning towards the free soil doctrine. He's not really radical like people like to depict him. Abraham Lincoln didn't really run on the platform of freeing the slaves, but he doesn't want to see the extension of slavery into the territories. Okay, so during these debates, Lincoln and Douglas will meet 7 times. Douglas will accuse Lincoln of preaching that the races are equal. Lincoln's going to say that slavery was immoral and should not spread, and he'll lose. This is for the election to the Senate, and Lincoln will lose this election, but that's okay, because he's going to win a more important election. Keep check. Why did Stephen Douglas propose the Kansas-Nebraska Act? What 3 events during the period May 21st to 25th, 1856 focused national attention on Kansas? We have the sacking of Lawrence, the Brooks-Sumner episode, and the Pottawatomie Massacre. What did the Dred Scott decision do to the Missouri Compromise? It declared it unconstitutional. Why did Stephen Douglas break with President James Buchanan? How did Lincoln and Douglas differ concerning the expansion of slavery? Douglas thought popular sovereignty should decide it, and Lincoln thought there should be no expansion. Okay, so this is where you would stop again, take note of the time, and we'll pick up the next time. Okay, section 3, crisis, John Brown's raid. So we've already seen John Braid at the Pottawatomie Massacre. Between 1857 and 1859, Brown is going to raise a bunch of money for this army that he wants to raise up. He wants to raise up an army pretty much of slaves to incite this slave revolt and establish a state for freed slaves. There's this group known as the Secret Six that are abolitionists and clergymen who are going to back Brown. They're going to back him financially. And he plans this raid on Harper's Ferry, which is a federal arsenal. Now, this does not work out very well for John Brown. It's him pretty much and his sons. He doesn't really get the support of the slaves like he thought. They don't really rise up. We have Robert Ely being called up, and Jeb Stuart gets called up too. And these are 2 men that are going to be quite famous during the Civil War. They capture Brown and the remaining raiders, and Brown will end up being executed. He'll be convicted of treason and sentenced to hang. He's executed on December 2nd of 1859, so we're creeping up closer and closer to the Civil War. And in the North, they pretty much make him into a martyr. He's like seen as a saint. People are just kind of going crazy over his execution. There's songs. It's going to be actually one of the songs that the Union soldiers are going to sing is going to be John Brown's Body. And I'll put a link to that song on your Core Sites page. But this is another thing that makes the South look at the North like, why are you not supporting us? Okay, so finally we get to the election of 1860. There's division in the Democratic Party, which never really works out good. If you've noticed, when there's a third party that's created, generally that party that's split is not going to win, one way or the other. Northerners are going to reject Buchanan's platform, which is the federal protection of slavery in the territories. So they're going to kind of go the Northern Democrats with Douglas. Southern Democrats are going to go with John C. Breckinridge. There's going to be a Constitutional Union Party as well out of this, so it's going to nominate John Bell. So pretty much the Democratic Party splits into three. So it's going to be these three running against the Republican Party and Lincoln. So Lincoln opposes the expansion of slavery, he supports protective tariffs for northern business interests, and he endorses the Transcontinental Railroad. He ends up winning the election without a single southern vote. Okay, so following his election, South Carolina approves an ordinance of secession on December 20th of 1860. They're followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, and they elect Jefferson Davis as their president. Okay, this is the last attempt at compromise. Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky proposes that they extend the Missouri Compromise line and guarantee protection of slavery where it already existed. But at this point, it's too late, and we're already headed towards civil war. This is just too little, too late. Okay. So we are, that's a picture of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. These are where the first shots are going to be fired. The Confederacy sends commissioners to Washington to settle the issue of federal forts that are in the South, but that commission does not get to meet with the president personally, so that's kind of an insult to them. An order is given, and a reason why they don't meet with them is that they don't want to, Lincoln doesn't want to recognize them as a legitimate government. An order is given for Fort Sumter to be evacuated by April 7th, and that order is given by the Confederacy, or, well, the order is given by the federal government for them to evacuate, but the federal government ends up sending ships on April 9th to send supplies to the fort. So this is looked at as a declaration of war by the South. They look at this like, well, you're not going to follow along and do what she said by evacuating the fort. Now you're going to be sending supplies or reinforcements to the fort, so we must defend ourselves. So April 12th, 1861, General Pierre G.T. Beauregard opens fire on the fort, and he's actually opening fire on his old instructor. Anderson surrenders the fort 2 days later, and Lincoln will call for 75,000 volunteers. So now we're definitely at it, going to war. This is going to cause Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, so the upper South, to also leave the Union. Here's your paragraph shrink words. Don't mind the albino squirrel. That's there because Matt told me that nobody notices the pictures that I put up in the PowerPoints. So that could be your bonus question on your quiz. SRQ check.